Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays for the Soul. My name is Reverend Tracy Howe Wispelwey. I am the Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement at the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. I am filling in for the Reverend Dr. Chris Davies this week, who is your regular host and the team leader for the Faith Info team at the National Setting. Thursdays for the Soul is a webinar series to care for the whole church. Topics are wide-ranging and focused on the spirituality and care for the whole church, people, and prayer, worship, music, psalm reading, or compassionate teachings are often included. So this is a predictable and regular gathering time, something to feed your spirit, offered by the Faith Education, Innovation, and Formation team and Justice and Local Church Ministries of the National Setting of the United Church of Christ. So today I am very excited to introduce you to our guest, Jocabed Solano, as we explore resilience and remembering and Memoria Indígena. So before we meet Jocabed, I wanted to introduce you to Lisette, who is an important part of our webinar team this week. Lisette is going to serve as our interpreter. So Lisette, before you disappear off screen, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Lisette. Soy reverenda de la Iglesia Unida de Cristo en la conferencia de Kansas, Oklahoma de la Iglesia Unida de Cristo. Hi, my name is Lisette. I'm a reverend in the Kansas, Oklahoma conference from the United Church of Christ. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Un honor y muy humilde de estar aquí. Gracias.
Thank you so much. So Lisette is a minister in the United Church of Christ. And as we seek to offer an extravagant welcome and recognize that we have many members and parts of our body, we are so excited to demonstrate that with this webinar. So you will hear Lisette's voice as we have this wonderful conversation with Jocabed, who actually speaks quite good English. But of course, when we talk about depth of our identity, belonging, and theology, certainly we are most comfortable in our first language. So I join you today as a host, but also a bit of just a moderator and conversation partner. As Minister for Congregational and Community Engagement, I'm tasked with bridging the work of community building that happens in our faith-forming spaces inside of our church buildings and in the liturgical life of our local churches, as well as in our public witness and community engagement. And so I reflect a lot on resilience. I'm actually working right now on a chapter in a book that will be released in the next year on grassroots organizing, meant to be a resource for our local churches. And in thinking about resilience, it's so important to come into greater stories of collective remembering. And Jocabed has been a teacher to me and a dear friend. And so I'll introduce you to her now. Jocabed, can you please just share your name and where you are in the world, some of your identity markers, and maybe, since we're still in this pandemic time, tell our participants who you are sharing this quarantine time with.
Buenas tardes. En mi lengua Cunatule.
In my language, Cunatune.
Cuando saludamos a los demás, decimos así.
When we say hello to everybody else, we say like this.
Na, benuedi. Lo que quiere decir es cómo.
And what that means is.
¿Cómo te estás sintiendo?
How are you feeling?
Vivo en Panamá.
I live in Panama.
Soy del pueblo Cunadule, uno de los 7 pueblos indígenas que existen actualmente en el territorio panameño.
I'm from the Cunapule, one of the towns in Panama.
Intentaré decir esta parte en inglés porque todo lo demás lo voy a decir en español.
I'll try to say this part in English because the rest of it I will say it in Spanish.
My people is Conadule, is a nation in Panama. Before Panama exists, the indigenous community in all Abya-Yala, in all Latin America, exists. It's a millenarian nation. We have 365 islands in the Caribbean Sea. I living with my father and mom and one of my sister. We ask for your prayer for us because the pandemic COVID-19, it is very difficult for indigenous community and it has many struggle in our nation. Well, I will going to talk more about my people when I present it, but nice to meet you. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Jocabed. So I am speaking to you all from the occupied lands of the Tohono O'odham Yaqui people in what is now known as Tucson, Arizona, on Turtle Island. And I am quarantining with my partner and spouse, the Reverend Seth Wispelwey, and then our 10-year-old daughter and our 2 Great Danes. So that's who I'm with here. And so we'll jump in. The hope for Thursdays for the Soul is that this would be soul nourishing. And certainly as we think about all that is going on, you know, what is it where, when we find there is so much injustice and an absence of justice, how are we to find healing? And maybe if we can't find healing, how are we to find resilience in our search and in our work towards healing? And so these are some of the questions that guide us today. And I offer just 3 short reflections and stories from my own life and experience and faith before Jocabed starts sharing from her work, Memoria Indígena, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. So certainly as you're listening, please put your questions in the chat. And we will definitely get a chance to engage some of those towards the end of the webinar. So some of this reflection on what it means for local churches to lean into stories of collective memory, to work in the space of collective memory and justice work and community building as a way to build the resilient community of the world that we long for, because we don't just want justice, we want a sustaining justice, and we want a world in which everyone can flourish. This intersection of justice work and community building is what I'm calling remembering. And if you looked at the title of the webinar, it's RE-membering. And like we have many members, or like members of the body, remembering, kind of like making, building, weaving. There is definitely like a building, crafting, creative part of this. And it's also related to the act of remembering. We have to know who we are. We have to know to whom we belong, and what we're a part of, this remembering. And so I wanted to lift up a recent example of Juneteenth. So Juneteenth just came along, and many people were kind of just awakened to it. They maybe didn't know that Juneteenth was a thing, but because the movement is alive in the streets, things like Juneteenth and the Tulsa Massacre have become more at the forefront of collective memory, or rather perhaps have been awakened in the minds of white people. And white people are realizing that the memories of Black and Indigenous people of color have been suppressed actively by the empire over the years, that it's not a federally recognized holiday, though Juneteenth has been actively celebrated in the Black community for generations. And why is this? But it's not just Juneteenth. And so my family and I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia for the last 6 years, where we lived and organized. And my husband grew up there, went to UVA undergrad. And prior to the violence that was very public in the summer of 2017, which we were a part of, there was active organizing going on. And one of the things that we were working on was this work of collective remembering, because Juneteenth is the day that is marked as the day when Texas was liberated. So Emancipation Proclamation happens June 1st, 1863. And then Juneteenth comes when finally the Union Army comes through and enforces the emancipation of formerly enslaved people. And we recognize that as Juneteenth. But the actual day of the freedom and liberation of people throughout the South and wherever there were enslaved people is a unique day for a lot of cities. And some cities do mark this and remember it. I think Washington, D.C. and a few others. But in Charlottesville, collective memory had been completely subjugated and was caught up in this very white supremacist lost cause narrative. And so the emancipation and liberation of formerly enslaved people was not part of collective memory at all. What was part of the collective memory that was passed down was, oh yeah, the Confederate soldiers, they totally took care of the university and made sure the Union Army didn't pillage it when they came through. That's what the collective memory was. So historians such as Dr. Jelaine Schmidt, who is a professor at the University of Virginia, and other historians worked to restore the records and said, actually, it was March 5th, 1865, a little bit, so that's a little bit 2 years after emancipation, when the Union soldiers came through. And that was when freedom and liberation came to Charlottesville. And in the aftermath of everything that has unfolded in Charlottesville since, now it has been a public reclamation, a collective remembering of Freedom and Liberation Day. And now it's a holiday in the city. So that's an example of the remembering work. And even though we're dealing with these horrible injustices, we have opportunities to reconstruct, restore, remember as part of all of the community building that we're doing. I think about the life of Jesus and the collective story that Jesus is continually asking us to come into in every kind of scene of the gospel. And I'll give just one little devotional kind of tidbit of this in the Gospel of John, when kind of a mob crowd is drawing this woman who's accused of adultery before Jesus, and there's a scene, and the system of law in that place would say that this woman is to be put to death. And I think about that scene a lot because I know that there's other women there. The impacted community of the unjust system is present. And these women are likely angry. They're likely organizing. They're likely fearful. They're likely talking about how this is happening again. All these things are unfolding. And I can read the nonviolent direct action of Jesus, and the purpose of nonviolent direct action, of course, is to escalate, to actually reveal, to escalate the tension so that the absurdity of the injustice and what is going on is made visible, such that during the civil rights movement, you know, young people sitting at segregated counters and then white people going absolutely mad and starting to like drop their shakes all over them. The point was the escalation so that people could see the absurdity and the violence of these systems. And I see the escalation of Jesus just drawing in the dirt, and the people who wanted to enforce the unjust system starting to go a little crazy. And Jesus saying, drawing into the collective story and saying, this is your view right now, and what you're trying to protect is the system. And I'm going to draw you into a bigger story of humanity and say, look at your own life and all of our complexity and all of our complicity and all of the ways in which you sin, and this story in which we're a part of. And how we are drawn, you know, whether our legacy is oppressor or oppressed, we are part of an entangled story. And coming into the complexity of that is hard, but it is also our hope and what the gospel calls us to. The last reflection I have in coming into greater stories of collective remembering to work towards resilience is just the practice that our church, the United Church of Christ, encourages as a liturgical practice, and that is Indigenous land acknowledgement. And this is a practice really that our partners, the United Church of Canada, has really championed and taught us a lot about. They have developed an entire website. I'll make sure and include that in the resources in the follow-up email, where you can actually find what native land that you're on. Now, this is a justice practice. The acknowledgement of native land is a justice practice, and that's the bare minimum. But what we're seeking to explore today is how can we move from this justice practice into building resilience, into the community building, to working with the Spirit of the living God and those around us, into actually starting to remember ourselves collectively. And so I wanted to just read a land acknowledgement that I wrote for Ecumenical Advocacy Days a number of years ago when I was serving as the worship director. And if you've been to Ecumenical Advocacy Days, you know that it happens in a big hotel in the outskirts of DC in Arlington. And so I drafted for the liturgy. We who are gathered here in the building of the Hilton Corporation in what is now called the city of Arlington, Virginia, pause to acknowledge the indigenous people of this land, the Piscataway, Conoy, and the Pamunkey people, speakers of the Algonquin language. They existed for thousands of years before this building and this city. We acknowledge them as the original stewards of this land, and we recognize the presence of their ancestors who still ask for justice. So I know many of our churches have included this as a regular part of our liturgy. And again, this is really the bare minimum and just a justice practice. But in seeking how we can build resilient communities, I think it is a really hopeful and inbreaking and vulnerable thing to acknowledge when seeking to build a resilient community in which we belong to one another. That in acknowledging that I live on the occupied territory of the Tohono O'odham people, that we belong to one another. I belong to them. And so I acknowledge this, and I don't know how to move forward entirely, but I have the tools of my faith and the gospel of Jesus to help me stand with my hands open in this moment and be faithful to how the story unfolds. So with that, I'm going to pause and say thank you for listening and hand it over to my dear, dear sister, Jocabed, of the Guna people, who will share about her invaluable work of Memoria Indígena. Okay, Jocabed.
Muchas gracias, Tracy, por esta profunda reflexión.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for this profound reflection.
Bueno, a mí me encantaría hablar un poco sobre la
I'd love
importancia
to talk a little bit about the importance
de escuchar las memorias indígenas
of
para la
listening and
Iglesia
hearing
global.
the indigenous memories for the global perspective.
Y para eso quiero comenzar diciendo, quizás lanzando una pregunta. ¿Alguno de ustedes sabe aproximadamente cuántas naciones indígenas existen en todo el continente que hoy
And for
llamamos
that reason,
América?
and in that vein, I'd like to ask each one of you if you know of how many indigenous nations are there in what's called the American continent.
Porque cada nación en
Because
este
each nation
continente
in this continent
nos habla de una riqueza en su lengua, en su
speaks to
cultura,
us about a richness in their language,
en sus
culture,
formas de entender la vida.
and the ways to understand the life.
Hoy voy a empezar un poco con la historia que quizás ya conocemos.
Today I'm going to start with the history that we may all know by now,
Pero que es importante recordar
but that is important to remember
para que no olvidemos.
so that we don't forget.
Memorias indígenas, invasión de los conquistadores. El desencuentro con los conquistadores en Abya-Yala, nombre como los pueblos indígenas reconocen al mal llamado continente, actualmente América, pero en América Latina desde este lado. Trajo consigo muerte de miles de personas, explotación hacia la tierra, que para el pueblo Cunadule es Natguana. El poder por el oro, por robar las tierras de los habitantes, la ideología de superioridad de los conocimientos eurocéntricos sobre los conocimientos de los pueblos indígenas, imposición de sistemas de organización social, económica y política, el método científico como validador de la ciencia y todo aquello que no entra en esta categoría es desprestigiada. La dicotomía entre lo sagrado y lo secular, la razón versus la emoción. Esta ideología de superioridad y de discriminación también ha estado alimentada por la teología colonial y lo podemos ver hoy con el símbolo de la espada y la cruz.
Indigenous memories, invasion of the conquistadores. The misencounter with the conquistadores in Abya-Yala, name used by indigenous peoples for the continent that others label Latin America, brought the deaths of millions of people and the exploitation of the earth, which is known to my Guadanule people as Nabuana. It brought the power of gold, the theft of the land, the ideology of certain kinds of knowledge over the knowledge of indigenous peoples, the imposition of certain social, economic, and political systems, the scientific method as the validation of science and truth, and all the knowledge that falls outside this category is discredited. The dichotomy between sacred and secular and reason over emotion. This ideology of superiority and discrimination was also nourished by colonial theology, as we see in the symbol of the sword with the cross.
Abya-Yala, Abya-Yala. Así gritaban mis abuelas y mis abuelos en el continente que hoy llamamos América. Abya-Yala.
Abya-Yala, Abya-Yala, that's the name that my ancestors call today.
Abya-Yala es un nombre que surge del corazón del pueblo Cunadule.
Abya-Yala is a name. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Resistencia y cosmoexistencia de los pueblos indígenas del Abya-Yala. El núcleo ético-mítico de los pueblos de la Via Yala estaba basada en la integralidad y lo holístico de las relaciones. En el caso del pueblo Cunadule, Dios es el creador absoluto. Sin embargo, el creador se expresa en la epifanía de Dios como padre y madre. Por el otro lado, el tiempo es visto de manera cíclica y la tierra es mamá, porque se entiende que la tierra es un ser vivo y que de ella germinó la vida humana por el don que le dio el Creador, es decir, mamá y papá. A través de este caminar con Dios ha articulado su espiritualidad, a la cual ha llamado el camino de mamá y papá. En la espiritualidad Cunadule, en la teología Cunadule, el camino de Dios.
Indigenous peoples' resistance and cosmoexistence in Abya Yala. The ethical and mythical core of the peoples of Abya Yala was and is based on the comprehensive wholeness of all relationships. In the Wanadule case, God is the absolute creator, but the creator is expressed in the epiphany of God as mother and father. At the same time is cyclical and the earth is mother, because we understand that the earth is a living being and from her human life germinated by the gift of the creator, who is mother and father. It is on this path with God that our people have articulated their spirituality, which we call the path of mother-father, the path of God.
Decía mi abuelo, hay narrativas que forman y otras que deforman. Los pueblos en el mundo están sustentadas por narrativas. Las narrativas como resistencia política. La nación cuna es un pueblo de poetas. La vida misma se vive a través de una narrativa y una poesía llena de colorido, imágenes, simbolismo, contraste, imaginación, magia, asombro, perplejidad, lo oculto, lo misterioso, los sentidos. Se evocan cantos que son cantados de generación en generación a través del tiempo. El Saila, es decir, el líder Cunadule, canta en su hamaca sobre el origen de nuestra organización social y política. Desde los más pequeños hasta los más adultos, hace silencio cuando el gran líder empieza a narrar las memorias colectivas y centrales de un pueblo que se ha mantenido firme en medio de tantas adversidades.
Memories from form and deform. My grandfather said that there are narratives that shape or form, and others that deform. All the peoples of the world are sustained by narratives. The Guna nation is a people of poets. Like itself is lived through narrative and poetry, full of color, images, symbolism, contrast, imagination, magic, astonishment, perplexity. From the smallest ones to the adult ones, all go silent when the greater leader begins to narrate the collective and ancestral memories of a people who have stayed firm in the midst of so many adversities. The memories of our people sustain our socio-political organization, giving us sense and identity. Their interpretation and how we relate them to the world is based in our spirituality. This collective imagination that has taken them to the world is based in our spirituality.
Desde la época
I don't know if I missed something. Perdóname, Jocabed. ¿Me salté de algo?
No, está bien. Desde la época de la colonización, Abya Yala ha sido golpeada por las ideologías hegemónicas e imperantes de Occidente. Es necesario preguntarnos, ¿de qué manera tantas naciones originarias han resistido a estas amenazas? Desde esta mirada, quisiéramos proponer una de las formas en que la nación Cunadule lo ha hecho, a través de sus narrativas.
Abya Yala, since the time of its colonization, has been beaten by prevailing hegemonic ideologies from the West. So we must ask, in what ways have many indigenous peoples resisted these threats? With this question in mind, I would like to propose that one of the forms in which the Guna nation has done so is through its narratives.
Resistencia, resiliencia y memorias de los pueblos de la Via Yala.
Resistance, ¿lo repites por favor?
Resistencia, resiliencia y memoria de los pueblos de la Via Yala.
And memory of the peoples of Abya Yala.
Las memorias de nuestro pueblo sustentan la organización político-social. Ellas nos dan su identidad. Su interpretación y relación con el mundo están basadas en nuestra espiritualidad. Este imaginario colectivo se ha ido formando poco a poco de generación en generación a partir de cada momento histórico, como las luchas y revoluciones de nuestro pueblo, y son una parte muy importante en la construcción de nuestra cosmovisión. En este sentido, las narrativas juegan un papel importante como resistencia política. Nuestras historias importan y no son tomadas en vano. Son una memoria sagrada que nos permiten analizar nuestro ser y entender en relación al mundo donde vivimos, cómo hemos participado desde la disidencia en la construcción de la sociedad, pero a su vez en la misma constitución del ser Kunadule reconocemos que se trata de una vocación recibida del Creador.
Okay, Guna narratives are present in every aspect of Guna life. The leaders, when they give counsel to the people, utilize their songs as a way to create consciousness about the reality in which we are living, based on the ancestral songs, which have a deeply social connotation. These narratives have strong elements of symbolism, which relate to the Mother Earth and how interdependence and harmony between things constitute an important part in the development of a people.
Por otro lado, estos relatos tienen el poder de traer a las memorias colectivas de los ancestros utilizando repeticiones que desde la mirada occidental a veces son consideradas vanas alocuciones. Por el contrario, cada repetición tiene el ingrediente de lo novedoso, que impulsa a saber qué va a pasar. Aquí entra en juego lo asombroso y misterioso y se añaden elementos nuevos que crean otras alternativas para poder ver y vivir la vida.
So when we see those things in our home or work, we remember the story with which they are associated. The stories also have the power to remind us of the collective memories of the ancestors by utilizing repetition, which from a Western viewpoint may seem to vain repetition, but each repetition adds a new ingredient, which makes you pay attention to find out what is going to happen. This is where the astonishing and mysterious come into play, adding new elements which create new alternatives to be able to see and live life.
Uno de los tantos ejemplos como la comunidad Kunadule ha sido resistente, resiliente e insurgente en medio de las adversidades ha sido la Revolución Kuna de 1925. Según el pensamiento que se gesta en la narración Kuna, cada gota derramada de sangre en la tierra es señal de sacrificio por lo que se ama. Si nuestros abuelos lucharon para que hoy estuviéramos presentes y nuestra nación no muriera, es necesario que luchemos aún defendiéndola con nuestra vida. Con Revolución Kuna nos referimos al conflicto sangriento de febrero de 1925 entre los cunas del entonces San Blas y los agentes de policía colonial insertados en varias comunidades. Las causas de la revolución han sido tan variadas como extremas.
When we speak of the Guna Revolution, it is in reference to the bloody conflict of February 1925 between the Gunas and the colonial police who camped in of our communities. The causes of the uprising were many and varied. The repression and violent abolition of our own ceremonies and rituals by the colonial police and indigenous people who had been schooled. The bloody imposition of Western dress to replace our traditional mola, raping and assaulting women. Continúa, Jocabed, porfa.
Como decías, imposición cruenta de cambio de la mola, el traje tipo occidental, atropellos, ultrajes, violación de mujeres, represión y evolución violenta de ceremonias y de ritos propios por parte de la policía colonial indígenas escolarizadas en la ciudad de Panamá, encarcelamientos injustificados de aquellos que contradecían a los policías, creación de cubles para bailes, expropiación de lotes de terrenos, robos, invasiones, penetraciones irregulares en las propiedades comunales, explotación de mano de obra en beneficio estrictamente de la policía, asesinatos desde 1921, incendio de la comunidad de Niadut y amenazas permanentes de quema de otras comunidades. Cada año esta revolución, para que no lo olviden las siguientes generaciones, se realiza una conmemoración festiva y uno de los elementos principales que utiliza el pueblo Kuna es la narrativa a través del teatro.
The expropriation, the unjust imprisonment of those who spoke against police, the replacement of our traditional mola, raping and assaulting women, the creation of dance clubs, the expropriation of land, theft and invasion of communal properties, the exploitation of our labor for the exclusive benefit of the colonial police, murders and midnight assassinations of those who responded to the provocations of the police, the burning of the community of Niabud, and the constant threat by the police to burn down other communities. Each year, this revolution is remembered, so that the generations do not forget, we perform a festive commemoration.
But aquí eso no está en la traducción, pero lo voy a explicar. Vale la pena preguntarnos cómo
So
los
it's important for us to ask,
cómo los pueblos indígenas en Abya Yala han resistido a tantos años de imposición y de violencia.
so how the peoples of the Gunayala have resisted all these years of imposition of injustice.
Hay muchas maneras, pero una de las tantas
There are
formas
many ways,
es a través de los cantos ancestrales.
but one of the ways is through of original songs,
A través de teatro narrado donde la comunidad
through the theater narration of a theater piece where the community
puede recrear el lamento, el dolor y la
can recreate the
resistencia,
pain and the lament
y la resistencia.
and
Para-
the resistance.
En el fondo lo que te dicen los abuelos es, ¿cómo te lo cuento de tal manera que no lo olvides? En el fondo los abuelos y las abuelas dicen, ¿cómo te lo cuento de tal manera que no lo olvides?
So in a way, and this is expressed by her twice, that is the way that the grandparents teach it to us so that you remember the way it was.
Narrativa, teatro y resistencia Guna. Una de las metodologías pedagógicas en esta conmemoración tiene que ver con el papel de cada persona que representará al dramatizar la historia. En muchas de las comunidades se incentiva que los jóvenes tengan alguna participación, aunque sea una vez en su vida. Cada personaje, por lo general, es designado de generación en generación, es decir, yo soy descendiente de alguna persona que participó en la Revolución Guna. Mi papel será el que mis abuelos o abuelas desarrollaron en esa época. Esto crea en la persona una mayor conexión con la dramatización, se vive desde la raíz y se crea un personaje que no es ficticio porque la familia recuerda el sacrificio de sus ancestros.
Each year, the revolution is remembered, so the generations do not forget, and so they perform the festive commemoration. One of the pedagogical methodologies used is drama, and how each person learns has to do with the part they play in the drama. In many of the communities, the youth are encouraged to participate at least once in their life. Each role is handed down from generation to generation. So if I'm descended from someone who participated in the actual historical revolution, my role would be to reenact the part that my grandparents actually played in the battle. This creates a greater connection to the dramatization in the person because you are reenacting something that is part of your own roots, thus creating a character that is no longer fictional because it reminds each family of the sacrifice of their ancestors.
Voy a hacer un resumen de esta parte por el tiempo, pero aquí entra en
Okay,
juego
so I'm gonna just
la
make it a
corporalidad.
little shorter due to time.
La corporalidad trasciende la abstracción filosófica y se enrola en realidad filosófica para crear algo místico. Es decir, el teatro nos permite trascender no solamente lo concreto, sino que en la abstracción colectiva hay una forma también de sanación.
The corporality of the celebration transcends philosophical abstraction and is rolled up in the philosophical reality in order to create the mystical event that is one people reliving their narrative through their bodies, which permits us to reimagine and recreate new alternative political propositions to face challenges that the Guna nation faces today. And she's trying to summarize as time is coming to a close.
El teatro es un espacio de incertidumbre, en donde el asombro y lo que uno siente se unen no solo para los que participan actuando, sino también para los espectadores a ser parte de la obra. De esta manera el pueblo Guna reconstruye los hechos, los actualiza y sigue enseñando a las nuevas generaciones la importancia de no olvidar. Desde allí se continúan formando generaciones cunas que contribuyen a la organización sociopolítica con un compromiso fundamentado en los valores comunitarios.
Theater is a mix of uncertainty and astonishment, where the feelings of the spectators and the actors are united, turning the spectators into part of the show. So for the Guna people, this remembrance has made us reconstruct the events, update them, and continue teaching the newer generations that forgetting is prohibited. From there, we continue forming generations who contribute to our socio-political organization with a commitment founded in our community values.
Ahora, todo esto lo contamos y la razón como cristianos y cristianas es preguntarnos, ¿por qué es tan importante los pueblos indígenas, en este caso de la Via Yala o de las Islas de la Tortuga? ¿Qué nos mueve? ¿Cuál es el compromiso que nos mueve a reconocer la vida plena en los pueblos de la Via Yala?
So how is it the way that we see the towns of the peoples of the Abya Yala and its representation?
Y la pregunta es, ¿por qué es importante para
And the
nosotros
question
como
is,
cristianas y cristianos
how is it
reconocer,
important for us Christians to recognize
conocer,
and to know
dialogar de
and
manera
dialogue
intercultural con pueblos que existen milenariamente en este continente que los
with
pueblos
people
indígenas reconocen como Abya Yala?
that have lived for centuries here and peoples like the people from the Abya Yala?
Porque como seguidoras y seguidores de Jesús, nuestra
Because
hermenéutica
as followers of Jesus, our hermeneutics
nos sitúa desde donde nosotros leemos y desde donde nosotros hacemos teología.
and it situates us from where we're at and what we do.
Para Jesús, la hermenéutica de
Jesus,
Jesús era una hermenéutica desde la
his hermeneutic,
vulnerabilidad.
it was hermeneutics from the vulnerability.
En el pasaje del buen samaritano, en esta parábola podemos encontrarnos con uno de los pasajes más ricos para comprender esa compasión de Jesús.
So in this part, we relate to him in the parable of the Samaritan.
En esto se presentó un experto en la ley y para poner a prueba Jesús le hizo esta pregunta: Maestro, ¿qué tengo que hacer para heredar la vida eterna? Jesús le responde: ¿qué está escrito en la ley y cómo la interpretas tú?
So in this, an expert of the law tries to take Jesus into account and asks, Master, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus replies, what is it written in the law? How do you interpret it?
Y creo que este es un gran desafío para nosotros como pastores, misioneros, activistas, personas que amamos a Jesús.
So this is a great challenge for us lovers, Jesus lovers, people who love Jesus.
Porque la pregunta también para nosotros es cómo leemos, cómo interpretamos la
Because the question is also how we read and interpret that.
Las narrativas bíblicas desde las narrativas de los pueblos indígenas.
From the biblical narratives or the narratives of the indigenous peoples.
No puedo hacer una profundización del pasaje, pero solamente quiero dejar con esta inquietud que el samaritano.
I cannot go in depth into this passage, but I want to question or pose.
El samaritano ayudó a un ciudadano no identificado, un nadie es asaltado, despojado brutalmente, maltratado, queda medio muerto. Y dos representantes pasan primero, el primero de un estrato superior, el segundo de un estrato inferior. Ambos lo ven y pasan de largo. ¿Por qué? Hay una regulación que dice que uno no debe tocar al muerto, porque si no se contamina. Pero la historia dice que un tercero de raza repudiada, un samaritano que iba de camino, vino cerca de él y viéndole fue movido a misericordia.
So the Jesus hermeneutics is to work with the most vulnerable, and from there he made it kind of the lecture of the way of his life from his own father. So we situate ourselves in that lenses to read life and then biblical narrative. So he is an identified citizen, someone who is assaulted and displaced brutally, and he's almost dead. So two other individuals go by, and then the first one from a higher status, and then the second from a lower status just go by. Why? So there's a regulation that says that we should not touch a dead body because otherwise you would contaminate yourself. But the story says that there's a third individual from an outcast where, the Good Samaritan who was on his way, like in Luke, and then as he saw him, he was in gratitude for him.
Él, igual que los otros dos, podía excusarse, pero no lo hizo. Su acción fue distinta. Acercándose, vendó su herida, echándole aceite y vino, y poniéndole en su cabalgadura, lo llevó al mesón. Este es un acto cúltico. El aceite y vino, símbolos de la experiencia cúltica. Es un acto de adoración a Dios. El samaritano hace caso omiso de la regulación y actúa como Dios. Vale más la vida que la ley. El culto añorado por Dios toda la vida. ¿A quién hace referencia esa historia? Jesús se identifica con el samaritano. Es el samaritano, Dios es el samaritano. La parábola invierte el orden de lo que debería ser, ampliando los horizontes para aprender del otro.
So the same as the other two individuals, he could just have gone, but he didn't. The Good Samaritan, his action was a different action. So he reached out, he cleaned his wounds using wine and oil, and taking him with him and took care of him. So this is a ritual, something that is a symbol of the ritualistic experience. It's an act of adoration to God. So this Good Samaritan, he obviously ignored the regulation, the rules, and just acted as God. The price of a life is more important than the law. So the ritual for God is for life. So what is that? These making reference to this story? Jesus identifies with the Good Samaritan. He is the Good Samaritan. God is the Samaritan. The parable kind of changes the order of what it should be, and what it does is it amplifies the horizons to learn from one another.
Y termino con esto. A veces nos cuesta pensar que los pueblos indígenas tenían el evangelio antes que llegaran los conquistadores a Yala. Pero una de las formas que nos invita la narrativa bíblica es reconocer de que aún aquellos que no son parte, pareciera, de esta invitación como el pueblo de Israel, que están fuera, pueden ser también aquellos que actúan desde el corazón de Jesús. Y queremos proponer que podamos mirar a las comunidades indígenas de la Via Yala como posibles protagonistas también de ese reino de Dios y cómo está actuando Dios desde el contexto, desde la cultura, desde la identidad.
So the indigenous voices propose that other way to understand the encounter with other different cultures is not from the colonialism, and that perhaps they already had God with them before even getting there, that without the recognition and the value of the plurality and diversity, as the gospel calls us, the indigenous voices propose an integral and holistic vision of community and respects the environment, social and cosmic.
Jocabed, thank you so much. And Lisette for interpreting. Thank you so much. These reflections are profound and so important. And to our participants now, I see someone entered a question in the chat. We have a few minutes to take questions. I invite you to put them in the Q&A right now. I'm going to read from John, who is attending an online school in Quebec, who says, they often recognize the territories of the nations where the courses are taking place. But by adding that they seek justice, it changes the tone. Love and spirit, is that the intent, or am I misunderstanding? So that might be for me when I read the land acknowledgement. So I think, yes, the land acknowledgement is an act of justice, but I think that the land acknowledgement is not justice itself. And so, you know, part of what we're exploring here is, what does it mean to build community together and to remember, member, which means we are many members of the body of Christ. And here we have a sister who is a part of Abya Yala and doing work of Memoria Indígena, working with indigenous memory and literally working to restore and finding resilience and resistance in the memories of her people and the ancestral songs. And what does it mean for us who have access to the power and the privilege of the empire? Certainly land acknowledgement is not the justice. It is the start of the justice. And so, yeah, it's just something to reckon with, you know, there's no answers. It's an opening, but land acknowledgement shouldn't be something that we just check off and be like, okay, now we're done. This is something that we hold. The next step is being in relationship with our Native siblings and seeking, what does it mean to be in community together? Are there any other questions? Well, we just have a few more minutes. I wonder, Jocabed, I have heard you sing. I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there an ancestral song that you feel comfortable, or that might be appropriate, or even just maybe a lullaby or something that you could share with us in this part of the church that might be appropriate? A small part of a song even. ¿Te puedes cantar?
Ah, sí, claro.
Una canción.
Sí, sí, lo voy a cantar.
Un parte de una canción.
Sí, es en la Casa de Congresos Guna se canta muchas canciones. Entonces voy a cantar este extracto, dice así. Gavida balar que no hay tomalo. Ay, ye de guille. Nana burba bala mide. Buene ki no hay tomalo. De guille. Es un extracto corto.
Oh, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. That was spirit-filled. Thank you. Okay, we have another question. So at the beginning, we spoke of memory narratives changing. We spoke a little bit about remembering and remaking narratives. So once we know that memories are being like purposely subjugated for the purposes of empire, and we see who is it that creates the change. And I would say that we must be careful to tell our own stories, and if those stories are not ours, and we know that there are stories not being told, then we need to listen, we need to follow, we need to accompany. So the examples I used of Freedom and Liberation Day coming to pass in Charlottesville, you know, that was historians and the Black community and organizers who had been working for years. And my work in that was accompanying it, and the churches that accompanied that, and predominantly white churches that worked and accompanied that, and then put pressure in solidarity with, and we responded to what those organizers and Black communities were asking of us. So it certainly was not our place, though we knew, to tell that story in the first person. And that's a tricky thing, because so much of this requires relationship and building. And so what I said is, we belong to one another. It's not just that the world belongs to me. I belong to the Tohono O'odham people. I belong to the people that are in the streets right now. I belong to the people in the detention centers. Then this is part of the hope of the entanglement. Another question. For Jocabed, how often is the reenactment done for each generation to continue hearing and learning of the collective stories? ¿Con qué frecuencia está hecho el reenactment?
Cada año se realiza en el mes de febrero.
We do it in February.
El 25 de febrero es la fecha principal.
On the 25th of February, that's the main date.
Porque la revolución fue en el año del 1925, 25 de
Because
febrero.
that was when the revolution happened in February on 1925.
Sí, gracias por la pregunta.
Thanks for the question.
Wonderful. Okay, well, our time is at a close, so I'll just close with this. Thank you from Phyllis. Thank you very much. This has been rich. I work for Global Ministries with African Indigenous churches. Many of the parallel experiences are similar with First Nation peoples and African colonial experiences. I have been struck with similarity of the land with African traditional relationship to the land, just to name one similarity. Has there ever been a dialogue between the communities? So I'll answer for Jocabed, just for time, because I do know her work. She does speak internationally and she travels around the world, although not in the time of pandemic, but I do know that she's an international speaker and a part of Native networks and communities around the world. So Jocabed, I don't know if you have ever spoken on the continent of Africa with Native communities, but that is the question here.
A ver si entendí que si también he podido compartir un poco con los del continente de África.
Ajá, que si has hablado allí. ¿Has tenido la oportunidad?
No, solamente he estado 2 veces en el continente de África, en Kenia.
I've been twice in the African continent, in Kenya and Rwanda.
No, he estado y he podido compartir un poco, pero no con indígenas, sino con hermanos de una organización.
Not necessarily with the indigenous groups, but most likely, I mean, it was more like an organization, a local organization.
Yeah.
So Jocabed, I'm going to invite you on the follow-up. Jocabed is part of, she has an organization called Memoria Indígena. You can support her work through that, and we'll send the links out in the follow-up email. Carol, I misunderstood her question. She was actually asking, I think, through Jocabed, the narratives as they're passed down through generations in the Guna people, when those change, just because changes happen, who is in charge of changing the narratives? And we might not be able to answer that question because we're out of time. But you did mention that the elders and the songs are written to kind of change. Is that true?
Yeah, but maybe if someone has a question, maybe you can share with them my email, and then I can answer by email some questions I cannot answer now. So
the email or the website, I'm typing in right now, memoriaindígena.org, and that will be again on the follow-up email. As we come to a close with this Thursday for the Soul, please tune in next week for another regular time of gathering and nurturing. Jocabed, thank you so, so much. And Lisette, for your interpreting. Thank you so much. This is such a rich time. You can share this with your colleagues, your friends, your communities through the United Church of Christ YouTube channel. And you can find out what's happening next on ucc.org through our Facebook page. And we hope that you have found this enriching. The love of God is with you.